Most people don't know how to paint sparkling water in rivers or streams like this, or these paintings. So in this video, I'm going to show you how. This painting begins with me outlining the composition on the canvas. The canvas I'm painting on is a 10" by 12" linen panel made by canvaspanels.com, so if you want to get some, there's a link in the description box below. I'm using oil paints here, and the colours that I'm using includes titanium white, burnt sienna, yellow ochre, cadmium yellow, cadmium red light, alizarin crimson, ultramarine blue and phthalo green. And these paints are made by Blue Ridge Oils. They're an artist quality oil, and again, if you want to get some, I've put a link in the description box below. Now, I've loosely marked out my composition using burnt sienna mixed with a medium called pale drying gel. It's an alternative to Liquid Original, which is what I was using before, but it's a non-toxic alternative. So it does speed up the drying time a little bit, not as much as Liquid does, but I'm just trying to reduce the amount of toxic mediums that I use in my studio. Now, we'll talk about painting the stream and the sparkling water in a minute, but first of all, I just want to give you an overview of how to approach a landscape painting. At least this is how I do it. So what I do is I paint the darkest darks first. So the dark values first. Value is how light or dark a subject is. We'll find our darkest darks and our lightest lights in the foreground. Then as landforms recede, the darks aren't as dark and the lights aren't as light. So here I'm painting the darkest occlusion shadows in the rocks, also the dark values in the trees on the right side of the painting. There's also some grass shadows there. I'm using a mix of ultramarine blue and yellow ochre, so you can get a pretty dark mix with that, and then I can add some titanium white for the shadows as the trees and vegetation recedes into the distance. Now, having got my darkest darks established on the canvas, it means I can gauge it off the white surface there. So I know where my darkest darks are and my lightest lights, and now I can start filling in all the mid-tones, all the shadows there in the mid-ground mountains and the shadows in the background mountains. Now, for those rocks in the foreground, I used a mix of ultramarine blue, some burnt sienna and a little alizarin crimson, and you can create a very dark mix with that, almost a black. Then for those other shadows in the mid-ground mountain there and in the background, I just added titanium white and a bit more ultramarine blue. So the mixes have an overall blue cast to them. So you can see how much lighter those shadows are that I'm marking in at the moment are compared with the shadows in the foreground. So really dark shadows in the foreground, then those shadows get lighter as we progressively work into the distance. And in general, lots of shadows that you'll find in landscapes often have a blue cast to them, especially in New Zealand. A lot of colours drop out, like greens and yellows, for example. The wavelengths just don't travel well over long distances, so many shadows will have a blue cast to them as you go into the distance. I also include my cloud shadows amongst my darks, even though clouds and skies in general are some of the more lighter values that you'll find in the landscape. Regardless, I still include these in my shadows. The other thing about my brushwork here is I'm not worried about detail at all. I want some loose painterly marks here, so I'm using some number 5 and number 6 bristle flat brushes here. Nice gestural marks. The brushes I'm using are made by Rosemary & Co, so if you want to get some, I've put a link in the description box below. Now at this point here, I got pretty much all my dark values established, at least the main areas of the dark values. So actually I got to work right away on the water, because the water was largely reflecting the sky, so I could use a lot of that shadow mix in the water. It's kind of a pale low chroma blue, but a nice organic natural looking blue colour. So this is where painting the water begins and how we can ultimately make it look realistic. Again, I'm just using these loose gestural brush marks with a number 5 bristle flat brush and using a mix of ultramarine blue, burnt sienna, titanium white and alizarin crimson. Now the burnt sienna really serves to desaturate the blue, and obviously the more we use burnt sienna into the mix, we're going to create more of a grey colour, and then Of course, if we use even more burnt sienna, then we can start creating some rusty colours or some kind of pale pinkish orange tones in there as well. You can actually see that on the left side of the painting where some of these rocks are going to go. Because the other thing I'm going to communicate in this water is some submerged rocks as well, which you'll see in just a moment. But anyway, I'm getting to work on the rocks here. Just painting the suggestion of reflected light as well. There's going to be plenty of opportunity later on in the painting to really add more detail. Now, one of the things that you really need to pay attention to when you're painting large bodies of rocks here, large masses of rocks, is you want to try and vary the shape and form and size of them. One of the errors that I've seen a lot of artists make when painting rocks is they often end up painting them in patterns. They're a similar size and similar mass, and there's just repeating shapes and masses. And it starts to look predictable and boring and can be a bit of a distraction in the composition. So we really want to vary the size of these rocks here. I'm also painting the suggestion of some submerged rocks as well. So the blue in this rock mix is going to have quite a bit of influence. Now let me just talk about the inspiration behind this painting. It's inspired by a place in New Zealand near a village called Glenorchy in the South Island, and it's just such a beautiful place to paint. I've done a lot of plein air painting there. It's characterized by really high mountains, and actually in this location, as you can see, this is the reference photo that I used. But I actually took these photos on the day that I went plein air painting here, so I have some great memories of this place. It's just really epic landscape. Now once I'd established the main body of the water and got some of the rocks painted in, at least the rock shadows, I then painted some of the grassy areas along the banks of the river. And then I just worked my way back in the painting. Now, as I said a moment ago, the reason I like to establish my dark values first is, for me, it makes it easier to paint the rest of the areas within the painting to create depth in it, get that recession of landforms, but it also helps me to get the saturation of the colours correct when I paint them next to the dark values. Like here, for example, where I'm painting the greenery in the lower half of the mountain, which is a forest of native beech trees and other native New Zealand trees that are growing in the lower half of the mountain. And they're pretty far away, so that green colour's dropped out. So it's some really low chroma colours here. And that's generally what we're using in the mountain. But having painted all those dark values first, or at least the main areas of them, just makes it easier to mix all those other colours and just make sure that the saturation and the value of those colours is correct as well. Now you could start off by painting the sky and working your way forward, and lots of artists do it that way. I'm not criticising it at all, but there is a danger that you could paint your sky too dark, and then so you paint that mountain in the background too dark, and then by the time you got to the midground you might have used up all your value range and you can't go any darker for the foreground. So that is the danger of starting with the sky and working forward. So I found that painting the dark values first makes things easier. I've also learnt this through plein air painting outdoors. And for this reason as well, the reason you'd want to do this is because the light is always changing and quite often it can cloud over, especially if you're painting in New Zealand. So again, if you've got the dark values established first of all, it makes it much easier to paint the areas in light. So here I'm just painting the clouds and skies. As I said, the clouds and skies are some of the more lighter values to be found in the landscape. And for this, I used a mix of ultramarine blue with a little phthalo green and titanium white. Now, as I paint the snow on the mountains here, I want to make the value of the snow a bit darker. So I don't want to use straight titanium white from the tube. I want to make it a bit darker so that once it's dry I can layer over some lighter tone. So I'll be saving my lightest values until the end of the painting, and this is what's really going to make your painting pop, especially when you're painting sparkling water, which you'll see in a moment. So for this part of the painting we're just trying to get all the main areas of lights and darks down and the main colours, just establishing the tonal range in the painting, getting those colours down, and then after that we can just make sure that the whole thing is working. and I'll be letting it dry, and then after that I can start the modelling process where I can start adding detail and refining areas, and then just building up everything by adding more details and saving those lightest values until the end. So here I'm painting a few highlights on the rocks, and I'm using a mix of burnt sienna with a little ultramarine blue, some yellow ochre and titanium white. So it's kind of a warm white really. I say a warm white, it's obviously a bit darker, but these stones are generally quite light in value and also quite pale, and there's a mix of these metallic looking colours but also some creamy coloured rocks as well, and this is forming part of the stream as well. So we want to have lots of rocks in this painting because the stream, or this river, we want this turbulent water there. There's a lot of turbulent water and it's creating that sparkling effect as the sun's reflecting off it. So the rocks are going to help to tell that story. Now in reality there was a lot more rocks there, especially on the sides of the riverbank, but I decided to simplify the scene, mainly to make things easier for myself when it comes to painting. But if you're just going to go and paint every tiny little stone on there, it could start to upset the composition because you can have too much detail and it could risk making your painting look laboured and overworked, and perhaps maybe you'd start losing some of the life and vitality out of it. So I prefer to simplify things like this. So there is quite still a mass of rocks there on the right side of the painting, but I did simplify it a bit more. I made some of those rocks bigger. I reduced the amount of rocks that are in the scene. And now I'm just painting the reflected light, getting some colours in there, keeping in mind the value as well. So I've got to be careful that I don't go too light in these shadow areas. So I hope you're enjoying the video so far. Now, are you struggling with your landscape paintings? Perhaps you're not able to paint the artworks that you'd imagined in your head, or you're struggling with composition, tonal values and colour mixing. Well, let me help you. Download my free Landscape Painter's Blueprint. What this does is it provides you with a solid methodology for painting that's going to give you predictable results with your artworks. Inside, I explain my process of how I select photos, do sketches, design composition, so I'll give you some composition ideas in there, then also colour mixing, understanding tonal values, and then there's also a painting demonstration at the end of it. So if you'd like that free guide, the Landscape Painting Blueprint, just click the link below. As I say, it's there for you for free. So at this point in the painting it was well underway, and for the rest of the video I just want to focus on painting the water and how we can make that sparkling water come to life. So here I was painting some more of these rocks which are semi-submerged under the water and just the surface is just above it. So the colour here is a bit more saturated, and I was using a mix of yellow ochre with burnt sienna, some alizarin crimson and titanium white. And I was just creating some different tones in these rocks here, some creamy coloured rocks and rusty tones there. The thing about these submerged rocks is they're going to be much more pale in chroma or saturation, and they're going to have more blue influence in it, the influence of the blue in the water. So that's something to keep in mind when painting these submerged rocks. I added more highlights to these existing rocks that I've already painted. And even though I'd painted the highlights already, I kept it tonally darker so that I had room to add even lighter layers of paint, and that's just going to contribute to the overall three-dimensional form of the rocks and communicate the bright sun. Now next I want to start painting the suggestions or the beginning stages of this turbulent looking water. There's kind of like rapidly moving water, especially past the rocks, and it's sparkling in the sun. So what I did was I used a mix of titanium white but also added some burnt sienna, a little ultramarine blue and a little alizarin crimson. So just keeping that water slightly darker, those areas of white water in this stream. I'm applying the paint here with a number 2 bristle flat brush, so just marking in some of these areas. Now another thing to note about this painting is you can see in the background, although the mountain isn't finished, I've kept the detail to a minimum. So I've also gone for a little bit of an impressionistic, more loose brush mark look because I think it creates an aliveness in the painting, and really reserved the detail more for the foreground. If I was to use loads and loads of detail in the mountain in the background and the midground, it could start causing a displeasing static in the painting where you've just got too much going on, too much information, could be a little bit confusing on the eye, and it might spoil the fluidity and expressiveness of your painting. So I still like to maintain some expressive brushwork here. Something that I've learnt through plein air painting, painting outdoors. The main body of the river was dry at this point, so I was able to add some fresh layers of paint just to re-emphasize some of the blue of the water and just paint around some of those rocks. And then I began the process of adding these sparkles to the water. Now the way I do this is I use a No. 0 synthetic rigger brush. So this has long bristles on it, and I've used a mix of titanium white with just a tiny amount of cadmium yellow, and that's just going to warm up the white so it's not a cold white that's straight from the tube. I'm using pretty thick paint here, and I was using some impasto medium as well. And then I just start marking lots of little dots which communicates the sparkles in the water, and this takes a bit of time. Now this works better when the water is darker because you'll really see the contrast between the white value of the sparkles and then the darker water underneath. The water here is quite light, but this still worked with this painting. When painting the sparkles, I was clustering some of them in groups, but then also randomly painting sparkles across the water. But specifically also around the rocks, like these rocks here where they're just poking out the water, because it's communicating that there's water rushing around it, and so it's sparkling in the sun. Now, as I say, painting all these sparkles took a little bit of time, but I find this a really enjoyable part of the painting because you know that the painting's almost complete and you're on the final home stretch. I just really love this effect in water, the way it looks like it's shimmering in the sun. And once I'd finished painting the water, I just added the last few finishing touches to the painting, so just making some value adjustments, perhaps adding some darker tone, just making sure that it looks realistic. So as I said, I've really gone for more detail in the foreground and gone sparingly with the detail in the background, so I still wanted to maintain a bit of a loose brushwork and perhaps a little bit of an impressionist look, but also with some detail mixed in. That's the way I like it. I'm trying to find the balance between the two. Now when you're trying to finish a painting like this, sometimes it's best to just finish up, leave it for a few days, come back to it and see if anything needs changing, see if there's any compositional errors that you've missed that might need sorting out. But other than that, I decided that this painting was complete. Now if you'd like to learn more about painting water, then check out this video here on painting a forest river landscape. Just click the thumbnail on the screen here. So I hope you enjoyed this video, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.